It's interesting because, yeah, Chris is right. Like, at a certain level of abstraction, everything stays the same. At a very high level of abstraction. And then at a different level of abstraction, everything is changing all the time. And it depends. I guess this book is making an argument for focusing on the level of abstraction where things are constant. And in our society, we tend to focus on the level of abstraction where things change a lot.
Yeah, and that makes sense because Stoicism is centered around this idea that the universe is this ordered, logical, rational environment. It's kind of religious in a way. He almost has this kind of faith.
Is all of life connected in a great unified pattern, or is reality nothing but randomness and chaos?
This week, we read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. It's a kind of personal journal written towards the end of his reign as Roman emperor, and it's all about applying philosophy to living a virtuous and effective life. Reading it, I was struck by the parallels to both Buddhism, later Western philosophy, and even contemporary popular thought. It's a book which bridges many worlds, and I think we'll all have a lot to say about it.
Marcus Aurelius lived from 121 to 180 AD. He was known for his benevolent reign, though he wasn't perfect. One of his most glaring flaws was leaving his son Commodus in charge after he died, a corrupt and Nero-like figure. Meditations is often looked back upon as a keystone Stoic text, but Marcus himself didn't consider himself purely a Stoic. At the time, Stoicism was akin to a religion, a worldview popular among Rome's elite, but Marcus considered himself more of an applied philosopher drawing from multiple traditions.
It's definitely hard to imagine how the words of a Roman emperor from 2,000 years ago could feel relatable and inspiring today. But in this discussion, we're going to be looking at a couple of quotes from Meditations as a jumping off point for our conversation, and I think you'll see that even after 2,000 years, his thoughts and Stoic exercises still feel fresh and relevant.
So, death and life, success and failure, pain and pleasure, wealth and poverty. All these things happen to good and bad alike, and they are neither noble nor shameful, neither good nor bad. So what do we think of that, guys? Are suffering, failure, success, wealth, and poverty really morally neutral? Or do they contain an element of good and bad?
What Marcus would say is that if you're poor, and then you feel bad about being poor, then that might be considered a moral bad. But the feeling bad itself about being poor is not a moral judgment. It's just you're experiencing pain because you have this interpretation of reality, which is causing you to experience pain. But if you had a different interpretation, then you would experience less pain.
Yeah, he'd say if you were feeling bad about being poor, then that's the problem, and that's bad. But that being poor itself isn't bad.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm just saying, like, with that worldview, it's hard to, like, come up with an objection to slavery, which Marcus didn't.
It depends on how you look at it, I think. I think you could take this philosophy into the modern era in which it does make sense for people to try and improve their social standing because you can make considerable progress on this within one single lifetime. Whereas in Aurelius's day, it took generations for families to improve their social status. So it was much less worth it.
That probably would have been completely impossible for most people. There wasn't really any social mobility at all, not even across generations. Or very little.
Right, and another thing that I'd like to add is that your lot in life does not necessarily mean something static. You could have a dynamic lot in life. You could have a calling, an internal calling, or a role in nature that calls for change. So if that's something that you see inside yourself, that I am called to improve my status in life, then I think Marcus would be okay with you doing that. But yeah, I think, at least judging from what was written in the intro to this book, that the elites of Rome, this philosophy was very popular with the elites of Rome, and it allowed them to become very complacent with how society was organized, and for them to take a much more static view of things.
I wouldn't even say it allowed them to become complacent. I'm sure they were perfectly happy with their status with or without the philosophy, but it allowed them to justify it in a nice way.
Right, that's what I mean.
What about you, Katie? Do you agree with the statement?
Well, I agree with it in a certain sense. I don't agree with the framing that, like, I don't agree with this idea that people should just accept their lot in life and not try to improve. But I don't think that this statement needs to be taken that way. He also mentions death and life, for example. Like, dying is something that happens to everyone. It's a part of nature, and therefore it's like just a natural process and shouldn't be seen as a horrible thing, should be accepted. Success and failure, pain and pleasure, wealth and poverty. I think he was also talking about people in all social classes when he was making this statement. At least the way that I took it, I think he was saying that the things that happen to you that usually you perceive as negative because they cause uncomfortable physical or emotional states in your body or a sense of loss are not inherently bad and don't need to be judged that way, and you can choose how you judge them. And I agree with that statement.
It's an interesting thing, right? Because when you look at our society that we live in today, there definitely are a lot of judgments made about these things. There's a judgment that life is better than death, and health is better than sickness, and success is better than failure, and wealth is better than poverty, and freedom is better than slavery, and all those judgments that we're, as contemporary Westerners, making all the time. Like, those judgments and the magnetic pull that those judgments bring towards certain types of actions have created a situation where we're able to put off death much farther than Marcus could have imagined. We're able to live lives of far greater health than anyone could in that time period, where we've criminalized slavery and nearly abolished it. And we produce massive amounts of wealth for the majority of people on this planet. And vast amounts of success. So those drives or the value judgments we make around those things, it's complicated. I can see value in making those judgments, but maybe what Marcus is saying, yeah, leave it at that.
Yeah, I don't think he would say that those things are not something that you should strive for. I think what he would say is that there's this logos inside all of us, and that this force, this life force, drives us to become more than we are. And so I don't think he would be like, oh no, capitalist society is evil because it's trying to improve. I don't think that's at all what he's saying. I think what he's saying is that if something bad happens to you, then you should not be angry at the universe or something like that. Just take it in stride and then work around it and do what you can do about it. But don't stress about it because you can't control it.
This reminds me a lot of the being and becoming dichotomy that we were arguing about way back, I think, in the entropy episode. And I don't think that holding an attitude of being and acceptance of your state and like trying to be calm and appreciate what you have and not judge what you have in the moment is incompatible with also trying to improve your situation. But it's kind of two perspectives that you can flip between.
The point I'm trying to make isn't that Marcus Aurelius' view and striving after success or life extension or whatever are incompatible. The point I'm trying to make is I suspect that when you do make value judgments around those things, like when you do make the value judgment that health is better than sickness, that life is better than death, that success is better than failure, that wealth is better than poverty, when you do make those value judgments, you're motivated in a particular way. And that civilizationally, we see like Western civilization, which is a civilization that did make those value judgments in a very big way, has been the one that's had the most success at realizing great wealth, at realizing life extension, at realizing revolutions in medical technology. And I suspect it's because they did make those value judgments and they were inhabiting that judgmental, dissatisfied with the present becoming state instead of the being state that Marcus is articulating here. And that was more common in, let's say, like Buddhist parts of the world.
yeah, you're saying that civilizations that embraced a more becoming philosophy became greater and made advances in medical technology and all of this. And
they made advances in the things they made value judgments about.
Right, exactly. And what I'm saying is that I don't think that Marcus's view is incompatible with that. I think that Marcus's view isn't a being view. It could be seen as a becoming view, but that you're trying to become something, but you're not trying to force other people to become something. You're just trying to influence other people to become something.
Well, it's interesting. Marcus makes a lot of judgments about his own internal state. So he does have a very becoming kind of perspective when it comes to how he behaves, how he acts, and how he reacts. But he doesn't make those judgments about the external world or trying to change the external world or trying to change other people. I think there's something to your point, Ariel, that like I do think that if you're making all these judgments about the external world, there's probably a special kind of motivation to change it, which would make you more likely to actually change your situation.
Yeah, that's a good way of articulating it.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to find the passage where he talks about influencing people. He doesn't say that you shouldn't care about what happens in external society. He just says that ultimately you can't control it, and you shouldn't. If stuff happens that you can't control, then you shouldn't let it get you down. You should just keep trying anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of a passage in the book that goes something along the lines of you shouldn't wish for the impossible. Like you shouldn't wish for, I don't know, something or other. And then the second example he used was you shouldn't wish for a child in old age because it's impossible. And it just really struck me, that passage, because it made me think of like the Bible, where one of the stories in Genesis is of Abraham and Sarah, who were elderly and still able to conceive a child because of a miracle of God. And it makes me think, like, it just sort of, to me, that really underscored a difference between Marcus's philosophy and the biblical worldview. Because in Marcus's philosophy, it's like, you divide the world between what's possible and what's impossible. You focus on yourself. In the external world, you can't change too much. You don't try to change it too much. And there's a lot of stuff that's just impossible to change, so don't even try. Whereas in the biblical worldview, it's like, it's kind of more along the lines of, you're a lot more powerful than you think. One individual can make a massive difference in the external world. And that which seems impossible isn't always as impossible as it seems.
Ariel, I think I do agree with you that there is a stark difference there. And I think we'll see this more as we go on. Not only does Marcus have this statement about not trying to change the external world, he also has statements about history just being something that repeats itself. And it's fine that we only live half a century because witnessing 50 years of history is the same as witnessing 400 years of history because nothing changes. It's kind of a melancholy and hopeless view in terms of changing the external world, at least at times.
It's very like, yeah, it's much more cyclical. It makes me think of he kind of has like a disdain for reading and for books and for songs, which are often narrative form. And you think like he disdained the narrative form. Whereas like the biblical worldview that ended up being more dominant in the West is all about the narrative form. In the narrative form, you have these cycles of narrative that take place, but each cycle of narrative leaves the world different than it was before. Like that's what a narrative is. It's what a story is. A story it's got a cyclic nature because stories have a particular structure to them that repeats, but it also has a linear element to it.
Yeah, and I got the impression from reading him that he didn't see the world in a linear, progressive kind of way, which would certainly be easy to do if you were living in the ancient world. I mean, there's much more of a perceptible narrative in the past 600, 500 years than there was in all of human history before that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess there was still some things you could look at as having changed, like the Greeks into the Romans and the Republic into the Emperor. But yeah, it's true. Like when you look at Marcus's reign, he wasn't a reformer. He was just trying to do a good job, similar to his predecessor.
Well, it's interesting because now looking back, we tend to see people like Marcus Aurelius and the Romans and the Greeks as a big part of the narrative, because it was kind of the beginning of philosophy, which catalyzed a lot of changes moving forward. And so it's funny that Marcus Aurelius has devoted himself so much to philosophy, but he doesn't see himself as part of a progressive narrative of learning.
Even the book he wrote is not about adding to anything. Like meditation isn't about putting forward new ideas. He's just taking other people's ideas, and basically the whole book is him repeating them to himself in different ways so they sink in better. Like there's nothing at the end of the book other than the first chapter is like a different style than the rest, but chapter 12 is the same as chapter 2. There's no progress that happens. It's just cycling through the same ideas.
Almost like the structure of his book mirrors the structure that he sees reality having.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Katie, you mentioned the passage where he talks about how if you live for 40 years, then you're not going to see anything. If you live for 1,000 years, then you're not going to see anything that you haven't seen if you live for 40 years. And I think in some ways that's correct. It depends on what you mean by anything new. I'm sure if we lived for the next 1,000 years and we observed everything, we would see a lot of change in terms of technology. But a lot of stuff would, I think, stay exactly the same. And I think he was right. There are ways in which he's right about that and ways in which he probably will be wrong. I mean, he definitely didn't live in an era like the one that we live in now, which is just rapid change everywhere. Just total upheaval every 5 minutes.
It's interesting because, Chris is right. Like at a certain level of abstraction, everything stays the same. At a very high level of abstraction. And then at a different level of abstraction, everything is changing all the time. And it depends, I guess this book is making an argument for focusing on the level of abstraction where things are constant. And in our society, we tend to focus on the level of abstraction where things change a lot.
Yeah, and that makes sense because Stoicism is centered around this idea that the universe is this ordered, logical, rational environment. And there is some kind of it's kind of religious in a way. He almost has this kind of faith that to me, it does sound like he has this idea that there's some kind of, intelligence or design to the universe. And that he does kind of put himself in this position where he seems to be claiming that he knows everything, that, it doesn't matter if I die now because nothing will change. Basically, this is, we already know everything that we're going to know. But at the same time, there's this kind of direction and order to the universe, pointed to by this idea of the logos.
It's interesting because one of the dangers of this idea of that worldview that you just articulated, Chris, is we can't always know what falls into the category of things that are constant and things that are in flux, right? It's like you get into Hume and the problem of induction, right? Like the chicken in the barnyard, every day the farmer brings food, so the chicken decides the farmer is that which brings food. One day the farmer brings an axe, and I think slavery is a great example because if you were, a Roman or even someone living up to pretty much any civilization before the Enlightenment, it would have just seemed like slavery was a fact of life. It was an inevitable part of human civilization. I'm sure you could have made arguments that it's human nature to have slaves and masters and stuff like that. And that ended up being something that is in the world of flux, not the world of constancy. So it's not, we can't always know what falls into which, and that seems to be where a lot of the danger is.
I agree, and I think that, at least Stoicism, I'm not sure about Marcus's philosophy, but at least Stoicism would say that you should try and learn as much about reality as possible so that you can discern which things are constant and which things are changing. I see Stoicism as kind of operating in the domain of the known. Like how Jordan Peterson talks about the known and the unknown. It seems like Stoics think, okay, well, this is just how the universe is, and it's always going to be this way. And it seems like they're not really preparing for the unknown.
I think this idea that
things... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
This idea that some things are in flux and some things are static forever is an interesting one. And while you guys were talking, I was kind of pondering this idea, like, are there any things that really fall into the domain of the static and the same if we zoom out far enough? Like there's a perspective where if we're zoomed in, then we see everything changing. And if we zoom out a little bit more, then we see everything is the same and cyclical. But then if we zoom out another level, humans didn't even exist like not that long ago. And we're saying that human nature is constant and unchanging.
I think it depends really on stuff that we can't know right now. Like, we don't know whether the creation of universes is cyclic or not. We don't know whether our universe was preceded. We tend to believe these days that it was began by a Big Bang some 15 billion years ago. We don't know whether there was a universe before, and we don't know whether this universe will end and there will be a universe that comes after. And we don't know what existed in the previous universe, or if consciousness in each universe is inevitable or has some form. So I'd say, the idea that everything is constant at the highest level of abstraction is definitely a big assumption.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you make, Katie, that probably every time you zoom out a level, there's stuff that seemed like it was static that actually is dynamic. And I think that maybe that's true ad infinitum. Maybe there's no end to that process. However, I think that Stoicism is a practical philosophy for how to live your life, and that there are things that change slowly and things that change fast. And the things that change slowly, you really don't have to worry about them because they take so long to change that you can imagine that they don't change. You can form a belief structure that trusts that those things will still be there all throughout your life.
Right. Maybe it's talking more about the practical level of a life in Roman times and making judgments about what is static or changing, like within that time scale, within that level. But I wanted to clarify my point. My point wasn't that if you zoom out another level, things that seem static are dynamic. My point is that if you zoom out a level, things that seem static are dynamic. And then if you zoom out another level, things that seem dynamic, those things might be static again. And that might be ad infinitum. It's really hard to, it's really hard to say. It's kind of just, for anything that you're talking about, whether you want to say that it's changing or stable, it matters what level you're at. And I don't think it's further out, it gets more static, and further in, it gets more dynamic, or vice versa. I think it's,
yeah, that's true.
Maybe we could say that's a cycle in and of itself.
It's impossible to know because we don't see the full pattern.
Right.
We can only extrapolate past a certain level. But yeah, that's a good point.
Right. It's true that once you see the pattern of how something is changing, then the pattern becomes static. It's almost like we live in fractals.
And then the pattern ends up being changing.
Right. The way that the pattern changes over time. But then you see the pattern of the way that the pattern changes.
What did I say? And sometimes the pattern of how the pattern changes is based on what the pattern itself looks like. So this is where we get fractals.
Oh, I was going to say this just reminds me of the process of integrating and deriving in calculus, where you're analyzing at one level, like the slope of a line, which is like the rate of change. But then if you take the derivative, then it's just a static number.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you go up another level and you're looking at like the rate of change of the change.
I guess to get this back to ethics, the real risk is making a category error. Like treating something dynamic as static or treating something static as dynamic. Like an example might be treating the existence of slavery as static and inevitable, when really we've seen historically that it's actually dynamic, versus like someone like Jordan Peterson would criticize communism as treating certain elements of human nature, like striving for success and comfort and stuff like that, as dynamic, when really they seem to be baked in pretty deep. They seem to be more static than many people had suspected. Or
maybe things like slavery are actually static. I mean, if you look around the world today, officially, I think slavery has been abolished, but there are a lot of ways in which it still exists. Or maybe it's cyclical. Maybe we abolished slavery, but maybe there's a time in the future where we'll go back to it. We haven't lived long enough to know.
Let's move on to quote 2 by Marcus that we selected. You need to avoid certain things in your train of thought. Everything random, everything irrelevant, and certainly everything self-important or malicious. You need to get used to winnowing your thoughts so that if somebody says, "What are you thinking about?" you can respond at once and truthfully that you are thinking this or thinking that. And it would be obvious at once from your answer that your thoughts were straightforward and considerate ones, the thoughts of an unselfish person, one unconcerned with pleasure and with sensual indulgence generally, with squabbling, with slander and envy, or anything else you'd be ashamed to be caught thinking. So Marcus Aurelius places a lot of emphasis on controlling the flow of our thoughts and as the gateway to Marcus Aurelius places a lot of emphasis on controlling the flow of our thoughts as being the gateway to virtue. What do you guys think of this idea? In morality, are thoughts, words, or actions most important?
Yeah, I think what he's getting at is that your thoughts are the highest resolution of all of those categories of things. So we have thoughts, we have words, and we have actions. And I think what he's getting at is that if you have pure thoughts, then your words and your actions, your pure words and pure actions should follow.
Yeah, I'm coming around to thoughts. I used to say it was all about it was all about actions. It didn't matter what you thought, it was about how you acted.
And certainly actions have the most impact out of all of those things. And you do need to act if you want to actually affect change in the world. But sometimes the correct strategy is not to act.
Well, yeah, that's not the question, is it to act or whether the question is whether you focus on your thoughts or your actions. Because a viewpoint that prioritizes actions could still have a doctrine of sometimes it's right not to act.
Right, absolutely. I actually am leaning towards the opposite, or I think I still emphasize thoughts more than actions, but I'm coming from a place where I used to completely emphasize thoughts and think that actions didn't need any particular focus, because if your thoughts and your philosophy and your intentions were pure, then good actions would naturally follow from them. But there does seem to be practice involved in actually doing good things. Like, you can mentally prepare yourself as much as you want, but having a philosophy is very different from having cultivated the skills necessary to practice actions that are in line with your philosophy. And you can even be totally conscious and recognize that your actions are not aligned with your thoughts, and that's still not enough. You have to practice the action itself, in my opinion.
What's an example of how that's come into play in your life?
Okay. One example I'd say is there's a lot of things that I wanted to accomplish personally and professionally. Maybe a concrete example would be something like saving money. You can have a budget and a financial plan, and you can know exactly how much you should be spending on food, entertainment, all of these different things. You should know exactly how much you can know exactly how much you should be putting away into a savings account every month, but actually doing it and practicing self-discipline with all of your spending habits is a completely different thing. Or another example that's often brought up is everybody knows how to get a six-pack.
I would disagree with that.
I mean, basically everybody knows how to get a six-pack. Like, maybe not in the most efficient way.
I mean, that's like saying everybody knows how to start a company, how to run a successful company. I think that statement is just false.
No, that's not true. Everybody knows how to get a six-pack. Like, most people know, consume fewer calories and do a lot of core exercises.
That's not sufficient.
It'd be sufficient for a lot of people.
Yeah, it would be sufficient for most people in their 20s and 30s. Like,
yeah. But yeah, the point is taken. I mean, most people know, for example, sugar is unhealthy and makes you fat, but people still consume it even when they have goals to not do so anymore.
Right. I mean, the whole concept of addiction is when you know something is bad for you, but you're like compelled to do it anyway. And I guess you could say that battling an addiction is somewhat about controlling your thoughts, but I don't think it has much to do with your thoughts. Like at times when I felt addicted to something, even in the moment when I eat that piece of food that I know I shouldn't, I'm thinking I shouldn't be eating this food. Or I'm thinking, okay, but I won't do this again in an hour.
Yeah, so I think what Marcus would say in response to that is that if you're finding that you're unable to control your actions, even though you're thinking a particular way, even though you're thinking, oh, I shouldn't be doing this action, then there's another thought that you haven't had yet that would prevent you from, that would motivate you, that would actually motivate you to take the actions that you want to take. And I think what he's getting at with sort of find that logos, find that purpose in your life, is that is what will motivate you to take the proper actions. If you remember what your purpose is, then that will motivate you to take the proper actions. If you just think, oh, I shouldn't eat so much sugar, then that's not a sufficient thought to actually lead to the proper action.
So I do think that thoughts are necessary and important, and I still place a lot of emphasis on my thinking. But I think another thing to remember with this is your actions also influence your thoughts. Your actions also influence your mind. Like, if I'm in a state of depression, the most reliable way for me to get out of a state of depression is not to think about feeling better and try to manipulate my thoughts into feeling better. It's to get out of bed and get moving. And then the blood flow alters my mood and alters my thoughts. Another important point is like when they actually look at the brain and when people pick up a glass of water, like the action takes place often before people consciously know that they were intending to do it. It doesn't seem like thought drives action, or at least it seems like it's more of a feedback loop than it is like a 100% cause and effect.
Yeah, and I think what maybe Marcus wouldn't say this because the theory of the unconscious didn't exist yet, but even when you go to pick up something and it happens before you thought about it, that doesn't mean that you didn't think about it before doing it. That means that you unconsciously thought about doing it, and then you did it, and then you consciously thought about doing it. So I think if Marcus Aurelius knew about the theory of the unconscious mind, he would say something like, your conscious thoughts affect your unconscious thoughts, which affect your actions.
It's a difference between, there's different brain circuits for if you're doing a known action and an unknown action. So something that you've done a million times before, like pick up a glass that you know how to do, you just see the glass and you pick it up and nothing's happening in your conscious mind. But if it's like, solve this Rubik's Cube and you've never done it before, then your conscious mind's going to be very engaged. It's just novel versus unnovel. Or if you're in a culture where there's been no glasses and it's the first time you've ever seen it and someone's teaching you how to drink from a glass, like it's going to be activating the conscious mind.
Yeah, I thought this passage was really interesting because it reminded me of when I was a kid and my dad would come up to me and ask me, what are you thinking? And a lot of times I wouldn't be thinking anything in particular. And so I'd have to sit there and like hem and haw, or I'd have to come up with something, that I wasn't actually thinking, or I'd have to just say I wasn't thinking anything. And then he would say stuff like, oh, why are you so secretive with your thoughts? Why don't you just tell me what's on your mind? And I'd be like, but there's nothing on my mind. So anyway, after I read that passage, I was like, oh, maybe I should train myself to always be thinking something consciously so that, I don't know. It seems like weird advice, but maybe Marcus Aurelius is wiser than me.
I mean, it might just be you weren't self-aware of having thoughts. Like I've definitely felt like as I've like gotten more into meditating and stuff like that, I've become more aware of like stuff that I'm actually thinking and feeling, like stuff that I would have just happened without me noticing before. I'm now more aware of it, which I guess is a conscious subconscious difference in a way. But that's one way to frame it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, I was a kid at the time, and I didn't have responsibilities and all this stuff on my mind that I have now. So I'm sure if somebody asked me what's on my mind at any given moment now, I probably would have something on my mind that I could tell them.
What's on your mind, Chris?
Marcus Aurelius' Meditations.
Seems upright enough.
Are you judging me?
Always.
I don't want to seem too anti this idea because I do actually think it's extremely important. And I tend to place more importance on motivations and intentions when I'm judging a person's actions than the result of the actions that they took. And I think it's important, like, even if you're restraining yourself from taking violent action, if you're still having angry, vengeful thoughts, I think that's something that you want to work on, because that's what's seeding your action, or maybe you're able to restrain it. But if you could get yourself to a place where your actual thoughts and impulses were aligning more with what you wanted, then that would be much better and much smoother. But I don't agree with Marcus Aurelius that you should try to train yourself to where you always know what's on your mind. I think that presupposes that everyone always thinks in a very kind of literary way with words that can easily be articulated at all times. And that's just not, I don't know, maybe this is a personal bias because that's not how my mind works at all. So if I was trying to get to a place where I could always tell people what exactly was on my mind, I would have to stifle a lot of thought in order to siphon it into something that could be explained.
Well, how do you think?
It's cloudy. Like, I feel like I think in terms of associations and bits of words, or like lots of sentences on top of each other at the same time, and kind of imagery like floating from one point to the next. But it's not, I don't know, I've talked about this with other people before, like in movies where they kind of have the main character and they're following them, and they have like a narrator who's narrating their thoughts. I kind of thought that was just a metaphor or maybe a joke, but because I don't have like a verbal stream of consciousness in my head.
I definitely do. I have like a line of words that never ends.
Interesting. I mean, yeah, Ariel, it sounds like your brain is different from how my brain works as well. A lot of times there aren't just words flowing through my brain. A lot of times there are. There are, when I see a movie where there's a narrator just narrating somebody's thoughts, I can relate to that because that does happen occasionally. But the majority of the time, yeah, there's not some kind of actual narrative going through my mind.
Yeah, for me personally, I only think in words if I'm thinking about how I want to articulate something.
For me, it's a constant line of words about everything.
That's probably because you have a writer's mind.
I think it's why I like writing, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's probably why writing is very frustrating for me, because I can't ever put anything down that feels correct.
I wonder if that's something you can train. Like, if you just practiced writing all the time, I wonder if you would start having a narrative in your mind, like Ariel.
When I'm writing more, it definitely like becomes more like structured, like writing, than it used to be. And it's like sometimes like when it like the train of thought actually becomes writing. Like it becomes like something that I could be writing down.
Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about how my default thought patterns are, I actually have a lot of just music that happens in my head, or like rhythms that happen in my head. And they just come unbidden and I can't make them go away until I distract myself with something else.
I definitely have songs get stuck in my head, but mine always have lyrics. Yours always have yours probably don't. Yours probably are just...
Sometimes they have lyrics, but usually not. Usually it's just melodies and rhythms.
So do you think that from this statement we can infer that Marcus Aurelius had a writer's mind?
I don't doubt it. He definitely wrote a lot.
Yeah, it definitely seems like he did.
But I guess maybe aside from the point of being able to constantly articulate what you're thinking about, I do agree with the idea that your maybe not conscious thoughts or like in a verbal way, but like your orientation thinking wise towards the events that are happening to you and towards people is very important and is something that can be worked on and changed.
And one question that's interesting to me is this question of with the way that Marcus is suggesting changing them. I'm a little bit skeptical because he's kind of saying, like, I mean, I sort of do agree with this statement, like this quote, that if you can have a mind that's clear and that always has like constructive, beautiful thoughts, then you'll have a constructive, beautiful life. But I question his methodology a bit because he's like this book, this Meditations, it's all about sort of a lot of what he does is like he puts things in perspective and like he expresses gratitude towards people and he's reminding himself of the impermanence of all things. And I agree that stuff's really important, but there's this like contemporary idea as well, kind of from Freud, that part of the way that you clean your mind is to dive into your psychology. So like, let's say I'm constantly imagining myself arguing with my brother. And I become self-aware of that, and I'm like, oh, that's not really a thought I want to keep having, but I'm having it 50 times a day. And so then, I feel like this path that he would suggest is like, okay, well, all things are impermanent. I am dust. My brother is dust. Everything will repeat. It's been going on since ancient times. And what does it even matter? Like his sort of putting it in perspective. I feel like I could do that, and it would probably help to a certain extent. But I suspect that taking a more like psychoanalytic approach and like going through a mental process that was more like, why do I keep arguing with my brother in my head? Like, okay, well, this stuff happened in the past, and I think that's affected me in this way, and it's coming up now because these things are happening in my life. And like understanding the roots of the problem, I feel like that's sort of what we talk about in meditation a bit. Like that's kind of how you pull out the problem by its roots so that the thoughts just don't come up anymore, and you don't always have to be struggling with them.
Yeah, apparently this book is popular with people who are leaders of large groups of people. It almost seems like this philosophy is helpful for people who are just really busy and maybe don't have time to pull out every problem by its root.
I guess we could say in a way that this book is almost like a... Well, I wanted to say for a second that it was like a CVT kind of approach, but it's actually not really. It doesn't seem to be that he's trying to consciously just alter behavior patterns and alter thought patterns. It seems like he's imposing a philosophy over the top of everything that kind of wipes out any undesirable thought that he might want to have. And he's just constantly going back to this one principle that all we are is dust in the wind. It's like he's trying to reprogram his mind based on one particular worldview so that it will align with the kinds of actions that he wants to take.
There's probably merit to it. Like maybe it depends, like Chris said, what kind of life you want to lead. Like it definitely does seem like there's value to what he's doing. But in other ways, it does seem like he's truncating what it is to be human a bit.
Well, and the reason why I brought that up is because reading the intro makes you realize how kind of really terrible and stressful this guy's life was in a lot of ways. He becomes king, and then immediately he's attacked by a bunch of groups on different sides of his empire. He has one of his relatives, I think, or somebody close to him that tries to basically usurp his throne. He has 13 kids, all of whom die except for Commodus, who ends up becoming the emperor, and this kid is weak and useless and ends up being just a terrible emperor. And he goes on this trip, I think, right before he writes this book, and his wife dies, and he's coming up to the end of his life, and it almost does seem like this philosophy would be the best philosophy for somebody like that. He just had just constant stress, and he was in charge of everything, and everybody was blaming him for stuff. And, he could either just give up or deal with it. So I think it's admirable that he tried to deal with it. And maybe the metaphysics or the methodology of saying, oh, everything is dust in the wind, so nothing matters anyway. Maybe that is not the healthiest way to deal with it. But in the absence of something like psychoanalysis, maybe it is the best way.
It seems like a useful way. One thought that I was having a lot when I was reading this book is, okay, Marcus Aurelius is not like a mind that's taking into account a lot of different perspectives and kind of going between them, which is an ideal that I've kind of come to hold up, especially after reading Robert Anton Wilson. But Marcus Aurelius does seem to have one particularly well-developed and useful reality tunnel to dive into a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, this question, if you don't mind taking a little bit of a different direction, but it makes me think of, when I first saw this question, it made me think of my days when I was more into like communist philosophy or socialist philosophy. There's an idea that's very popular in Marxism that practice is more important than theory. And there's a lot of disdain for people who get caught up in theory or in theorizing too much and who don't actually put into practice the work of the revolution. And it's interesting because in some ways Marcus's philosophy kind of parallels that, because he's like, okay, you got the theory here. This is a good theory. Learn the theory, but the really important thing to do is to put it into practice and into action. But it's funny because at the same time, he's sort of hit the action that he's putting forward is action on your own mind, whereas in socialism, in Marxism, they don't really care what's going on in your mind. It's just about, are you contributing to the revolution or not?
Yeah, that does seem like a useful perspective, that action, whether it be external or internal, is important for change to occur. So I definitely agree with that.
It's got its pitfalls, though. It's like you get Marxist revolutions where, like, a lot of the people in them are, like, really corrupt or have a lot of issues that they haven't worked out, and it ends up affecting things in a negative way.
Yeah, revolution is one of those things that you definitely want to be careful with. Definitely want to make sure that you're replacing the current order with something that's going to be better, and that the cost of destroying everything in the meantime is actually worth it.
Well, there's an idea in anarchism of prefigurative politics. I'm not sure if this is popular in Marxism as well, but it's basically this idea that if you're starting a revolution or an evolution or anything like that, that the way that these things happen, it's not just like, you know, you topple the current order and then you implement your new order and it's perfectly in line with the philosophy that you espoused. It's that a hub of people develops a certain set of ideas and a way of being and a way of interacting with one another. And then that expands to more and more people. Basically, you're building a culture and trying to grow it to the point where that culture becomes more powerful than the current structure. And then when the revolution happens, the culture that would be post-revolution would be the same or come from the seed of the culture and the way that people interacted with each other as they were strategizing about the revolution. So, for example, if you're a socialist and you believe in worker co-ops and you believe in non-hierarchical organizations, then you don't want to organize your revolution in a hierarchical way, because then what you'll get at the end is a lot of people who have joined your revolution and become a powerful force who are in a pattern of working with one another in a hierarchical way.
Yeah, that idea definitely exists in ancom politics. I'm not sure about Marxism. To be clear, I was never actually a Marxist. I was an ancom, but it was influenced by Marxism a lot. So that idea definitely exists, but there's a counter idea too. In some anarcho-communist circles of like contempt for lifestyleism. Like the idea is that like if prefigurative politics are all that you're doing and you're not actually trying to like confront the powers that be, then you're basically just creating a comfortable, happy life for yourself and your friends, and you're not really changing things.
Yeah, I almost feel like that's the flaw in the philosophy, that if you have to totally subvert your philosophy in order to change the existing order, then maybe the existing order is better than your philosophy.
Well, not all philosophies are contradict revolution.
Sure.
Well, I just wanted to say I can kind of see a metaphor there of like your thoughts being almost like the prefigurative politics of your action. Like how you're interacting with your own inner voice and your own mind, and how you're modeling. I think thoughts a lot of times serve to model how you want to behave. Like somebody says something to you and then you might think something nasty back at them, which is like a model for the behavior that you might act out unless you suppress that. So you could say that your thoughts are like the prefigurative politics to your action, where there's a connection there, but it's not the only thing.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. That's definitely can see that. It's the same thing, like it works in a positive direction too, in a negative way. Like if you have a crush on someone and you're acting weird around them, it's like it's because there's something in your thoughts and you're trying to like hold it in and not have it be expressed. And so you have to like be really deliberate with your actions, and it takes up a lot of energy to have that disconnect.
Yeah. And I think that Aurelius would agree with that. And he would say this is why it's important to have thoughts like if you feel really angry about something or you want to take revenge on somebody, that you should realize that feeling in a context. And, as he says, the best revenge is to not be like that.
Okay, so Aurelius wins this round.
Ding, ding, ding.
Do you want to read quote 3, Chris?
Way number 1, mixture, interaction, dispersal, or way number 2, unity, order, design. Suppose 1. Why would I want to live in disorder and confusion? Why would I care about anything except the eventual dust to dust? And why would I feel any anxiety? Dispersal is certain whatever I do. Or suppose 2. Reverence, serenity, faith in the power responsible.
Thanks, Chris. One thing I find interesting about Marcus Aurelius is that he frequently compares 2 conceptions for how the universe might work. One, where everything is fragmentary and random, and a second, where everything is part of a grand unified whole, governed by the gods. So, of these 2 possibilities, which most appeals to us? And do we agree that these are the only 2 possibilities that might exist? Either a fragmentary, random universe of small atoms, or a universe where everything is somehow unified?
I mean, what immediately comes to mind is that it's neither of these, that it's some mixture of these. And I think Jordan Peterson would say that the order model of the universe is the domain of the known. And the chaos model of the universe is the domain of the unknown. And of course, reality is never known completely, nor is it ever unknown completely. There's always pieces of it that we know and pieces of it that we don't know. So I would definitely say both of these realities are correct.
Okay, I disagree. Well, I agree with you about your first point that I think it's somewhere in between, or a mix of these 2, or something that kind of encompasses both views. But I don't see ordered as the known and chaos as the unknown. I think a lot of times the more that we know and find out about the universe, the more that we find that structures that we assume are whole and structured, like a human body, actually are made up of atoms, and it's less clear where the boundaries of objects are than it appears to the eye. So I don't think that this view of dispersal and quote unquote chaos is just about the unknown. But I also don't think that things being fragmented and fluid and this dust to dust view necessarily means chaos. Like, if you imagine a swirling pool of liquid, there is an order to that. It's not so easy to follow, but there is an order to it. It's not random.
I agree. And there are things like fluid dynamics to describe how things like that work. And that's an example of order, I would say.
Well, I think an important distinction to make here in response to Katie's first point is there's when order is associated with the known, it's not necessarily a statement that the things we happen to know always happen to be more orderly. It's a statement about what the process of gaining knowledge is. And the idea is that when we gain knowledge about something, we're creating an ordered process within ourselves. So, in the idea of this model, atoms have always existed the way that they exist. That they used to be shrouded in mystery. Or let's say in Marcus Aurelius' time, the word atom basically referred to tiny, homogeneous particles of which everything was made. So it's a very abstract definition of an atom. And it's a more orderly concept than our current understanding of an atom. But the idea is that we've gained an order, we've created order from chaos in coming to have a model of the atom that is more accurate. So even though that model is itself chaotic, the fact that we have it, that we have the gift of that model now, means that our internal world and the relationship between our internal world and the external world is more ordered.
I would add that order is, when people talk about that things are ordered, what they mean is that generally we can predict what's going to happen. So even if we look at a chaotic system that we can't predict every element of, we might be able to predict its general behavior. And there might be no unexpected events that happen inside that chaos. And so we have a model for looking at it that, even though it doesn't tell us every single thing about it, it's still ordered, and it allows us to predict the future.
Yeah, it's both prediction and greater correspondence between different patterns, or more tight patterning. And so when we have a model of the atom that's more accurate, imperfect though it may be, that's creating order because there's a tighter correspondence between the atom in here and the atom out there, versus if I was just thinking about atoms as little balls. Like, it's a more orderly concept, but there's less order because there's a bigger discrepancy.
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure what I think of it. I'm kind of chewing on it right now. It rings true that what we perceive as ordered versus chaotic just has to do with what we understand versus what we don't. But I guess that leads me to question, is there some kind of order versus chaos that's inherent in certain types of processes unrelated from how we perceive it? Because when Marcus is talking about imagining these two types of universes, at least the way I interpret him, is he's imagining two types of universes. He's not saying that imagine that we can understand the universe versus imagine that we don't understand the universe.
Yeah, he's positing two kinds of universes.
Right, and the distinction between order and chaos in those universes isn't coming from whether or not we understand the model.
No, that's true. I guess bringing it to that level brings it to an epistemological level. I'm really just talking metaphysically. There is still the possibility that there's a dualism. Right? There's regions of the universe that are ordered, or levels of abstraction that are ordered, and levels of abstraction that are chaotic. So that still is a possibility metaphysically.
So just looking back at this quote, why would I want to live in disorder and confusion? Why would I care about anything except the eventual dust to dust? So it seems like he's positing that there are these two different kinds of universes that might exist, but it doesn't seem like he knows which one it really is. He's just saying, well, in this case, in the case of disorder and confusion, then why would I care about anything? Everything is just dust to dust. And in the case of order and reverence, serenity, and faith, then there's meaning in everything. And so basically one of those two attitudes is preferable. It doesn't seem like he's asserting which one he actually thinks is the case. It just seems like he's saying, well, if it's disorder, then, everything is dust to dust, so nothing matters. And if everything is ordered, well, then that's really cool.
Right. It's kind of like an early Pascal's wager.
I'm kind of with Marcus here. Like, I like what he does, that he's basically considering these two possibilities. I mean, a third possibility that comes to mind for me is that we could live in a universe where order is in constant battle against chaos. And maybe that's what good and evil is a metaphor for. Good is the force of order, trying to create patterns and harmony and coherence, and evil is the chaos that's constantly eroding good. And another metaphor is entropy versus like the constant march of entropy.
This reminds me again of our entropy discussion, where Ariel and Chris were saying that beauty is a lack of entropy and beauty equals order. And Kurt and I were taking the position that there is beauty in a bit of chaos and a bit of unknown as well. And now it's gotten so far as to say that like chaos and entropy is evil.
I'm not making that statement. I'm just positing it as a way of looking at it.
Right.
Yeah, Ariel said that good and evil could be seen as a metaphor for chaos and order. I don't think that you can absolutely say that when something is chaos, that it's evil, but I think that you can say that chaos tends to erode order. And that actually might be good, because the order might be wrong. You might have a model that isn't in resonance with reality. And so in that case, chaos can actually be a force for good.
Yeah. And I would say something like reality is always shifting. So maybe that is something more like order and chaos are forces in battle with each other, but not that one is good and one is evil. It's that we're constantly building orders to try to align with what's going on around us, but what's going on around us is in a state of change and is in kind of in a state of chaos. So at a certain point, the order no longer aligns with where the world is, and chaos is necessary to realign it.
I feel like that perspective that you're putting forward, Katie, is very much in line with Marcus's chaotic world. Because you're basically saying the outside world is chaotic and we impose an order upon it. And the order is never out there, it's in here. And then, the flow of chaos destroys our orderly structures and we have to build new ones. So that's sort of like what Marcus is in his worst case scenario of it all being chaotic. He's like, well, I'll still create order because I like it better. But then you're just pumping order out into a world that's always going to destroy it.
I think on a human scale, that's true. Maybe there's a higher level where the universe is more ordered and isn't totally chaotic. But I think on a human level, yeah, we are pumping out order and the world is going to destroy it. Death is the most clear example.
Well, in Marcus's other worldview, he views death as just part of the same larger pattern, the same holistic whole. Yeah.
Which, yeah, that is a valid way of looking at it. But then it seems like we're back at the viewpoint again that dust to dust is all that matters because death is part of the order and suffering is part of the order. So then it seems to, then I don't understand in this viewpoint why he's trying to create something harmonious.
And one way to look at it could be a personal preference. Like instead of raging against nature, to just accept whatever happens. You'll be happier. Have less suffering. Kind of like the Buddhist thing.
Yeah, I think one shortcoming of Marcus's view is that he doesn't see life as a narrative. He sees, everything lives and everything dies and ashes to ashes and dust to dust. But what he doesn't recognize is that life itself has continued since it began. Or maybe there were some false starts, 4 billion years ago or something like that. But eventually, it kind of overtook the planet, and it does seem to be going somewhere. And especially since we discovered that there are planets and stars that we can go to. It seems like that's the narrative. The narrative is that we should go to the stars, and we should expand life to as many different places as we can. Kind of like Isaac Asimov talks about in The Last Question.
I mean, I understand the appeal of what Marcus is saying, kind of, and the appeal of viewing the universe as a harmonious whole, where nothing that happens is really bad, it's just what happens. Because when you look at the universe that way, it allows you to be much more accepting when things go wrong, or when your life's not what you want it to be, and stuff like that. Versus when you're polarizing the world into good and evil, things take on a certain significance that doesn't always feel very good. Or else you're more on a roller coaster of highs and lows.
I guess I would say everything is contextual. I don't think either viewpoint of the world is correct or incorrect. Seeing the greater order and seeing life and death and everything that happens to you as part of that order is a perspective that's perfectly valid, and zooming in to the level of your life and saying what's good for me as an organism and mapping good to your sensory experiences is not invalid either. And different perspectives may serve you in different moments. It seems that he's chosen to take this larger perspective all the time, but I doubt he actually does. Like, I'm sure he experiences sadness and tries to prevent certain things from happening, and there's probably some base level of him that tries to battle nature.
Yeah, I mean, he seems agnostic about some things, but I feel like the way that you just framed it, though, Katie, presupposes a universe that functions in a particular way. I think in the chaotic way. Like, you're definitely presupposing a universe where good and evil are human constructs.
Well, I think it would apply equally as well, even if we presupposed, like, a Christian universe, and then life and death would be just aligned with God's plan.
Right, but if it is like a Christian universe, or a universe that there are, like, good and evil are superhuman concepts in some way, then it's not just that we're taking our sensory experience and mapping good and evil onto them, or even mapping a greater holistic plan. Because there's a good and evil conception, there's the holistic whole conception, and there's the chaotic conception. And each one is kind of distinct. And the first two are like superstructures, and the third one is basically saying there is no superstructure.
Well, and I think that each of them can blend potentially into the others by postulating that small things can combine together in such a way as to have this emergent property at a higher level. So when Jordan Peterson talks about good and evil, he says good is that which leads to heaven and evil is that which leads to hell. And heaven and hell are subjective concepts as well. Each person has their own personal heaven and their own personal hell. And humanity has, a human level heaven and a human level hell. And so maybe life itself or the universe has something equating to that. But I think we should try and there's only so much we can know about the universe. And so we should take the highest level view that we have, use that to extrapolate where a certain action will go, and use that to take the actions that will lead to somewhere good.
Well, the problem is we don't know which view is the highest level view that we have.
I know what view is the highest level view I have.
What's the highest level view you have?
On the longest time scale and the largest space scale. So for me, the highest good is doing that which is good for life. So if life moves to other planets and creates order, and humans are somehow not a part of that, then that would be preferable to me than humans surviving in the short to medium term and everything else dying or something like that.
How is life the highest level view? Why is life the highest level view?
Because we came from life. And life was around for way longer than people were. Life is much more sustainable than...
We came from atoms, which have been around for a lot longer than life. Disconnected atoms.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant. What I'm saying is that life is...
we came from rock. Rocks are higher level than life. They've been around for longer and will probably be around for longer, assuming life ends at a certain point.
Sure, yeah. Rocks are everywhere. We don't have to fight for the existence of rocks. Literally, the entire universe is made up of rocks. And
okay, so you're making some value judgments beyond what's the highest level view.
Yeah, you're prioritizing life. You're not prioritizing the highest level view.
My highest level view is the view that's espoused in the last question, which is that life will end up becoming the universe, and then it will end up recreating the universe.
I mean, that's all well and good, but that's a personal philosophy. It's not based on...
Well, everything is a personal philosophy. You asked me
but
what my personal philosophy was. What's your non-personal philosophy?
I get it. No, I think that's a great philosophy, Chris, but you were making reference to the highest level view to justify your philosophy, and I'm saying it's not really a highest level view.
Yeah, it's my opinion on what the highest level view is.
Well, there's no way that life is highest level, though. Highest level of what? What is the life the highest level of? Okay, highest good, but there's no way to determine that objective. That's just your subjective interpretation.
It's the thing that is the most sustainable. It's the thing that is going to last the longest.
Well, no, because rocks are a much better candidate for the thing that's going to last the longest. Rocks have existed much longer than life. Yeah, hydrogen atoms or maybe photons.
Yeah, but that's not a narrative. Rocks are not a narrative. Rocks are just something that's there.
Okay, so you're prioritizing having a narrative. You're not just looking at the highest level. Maybe you're looking at the highest level of value for which you can impose a narrative, or highest level of abstraction for which you can impose a narrative.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's completely subjective.
Because otherwise there isn't a narrative, and otherwise there isn't a purpose to anything.
Yeah,
you can create narratives that don't involve life. That's just a lack of creativity to not be able to construct a narrative
that I'm a part of.
No, that's not what you said. You just said
that's what I mean. A narrative that I can participate in.
Well, you as a life form are participating in a narrative that's larger than life itself. I can create that narrative. We can.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light was good, and he separated light from darkness, and so on and so forth. It's a narrative without living things.
What? God is living.
No.
Yeah. What do you think God is?
I don't think God could be defined as living the way that life is scientifically defined.
I very much disagree with that.
Okay, if you're looking for the existence of a narrative that doesn't involve living things, God could easily be understood as a metaphor in that particular passage, which, by the way, was the beginning of the Bible.
And the ending of The Last Question by Isaac Asimov is "Let there be light." It's literally the life of the previous universe becomes the God of the next universe.
I think this is a fine way to interpret things, Chris, but I'm just trying to get to, like, this is your interpretation. Like, this is not, like, given by anything that you're saying. Like, the ideas that you need a living things to have narratives, and that narrative is necessary for a story to have meaning, and that you need to be part of the story, and that therefore that, like, all these things are big assumptions. They're not, this isn't, like, an inevitable philosophy to take on.
Right, it's my own personal philosophy, sure.
Okay.
But it's a narrative that I feel comfortable defining my life within, because it allows me to feel like things that I do have purpose. If there isn't a narrative, then nothing has purpose.
Well, the way that we got to this, okay, and also that's not necessarily, that seems like an assumption, but the way that we got to this is we were talking about what's the highest level, and you said, well, we know what the highest level is, and then you just gave like a very personal construction of what your highest level is for like a lot of reasons that are very particular to you, and dismissed any other possibility. Everybody
has their own highest level. And so and everybody knows what that highest level is. So that's why I can tell you what my highest level is.
That not everybody has their own highest level, and not everybody knows what their own highest level is. Not everybody can tell you what
those people have very meaningless lives.
Well, not everyone bases the meaning in their life or their philosophy off their highest level. Like, you see a lot of people.
Yeah, like myself included. Myself included. I don't base the meaning of my life out of like the highest level of abstraction. I think that when I abstract away higher and higher, my life personally seems less and less meaningful. And the meaning of my life requires zooming in, which it does to you too. That's why you zoom into the level of life and the narrative that you can feel a part of.
It has a zoomed in version and a zoomed out version, and they are connected together. And that's what makes everything feel meaningful.
I mean, you just placed a bunch of restrictions on how far we could zoom out because you said then it would be meaningless.
That's not true. There is no restriction on how far we can zoom out. I zoomed out all the way to the level of the multiverse. That's pretty far. I can go further if you want.
You zoomed out to the level of life.
Yes, and life will potentially encompass all of the universe. That's what I'm saying.
But if it doesn't, then is everything meaningless? I mean, there being any meaning at all for you seems to ride on the possibility of life expanding and taking over the multiverse. And that, I mean, that's fine, but that's not how...
Do you have a better narrative?
That's a weird question. I have... Like, I see narratives as imbuing meaning into many different levels. And I think that if you're a good enough writer, you can imbue meaning into the tiniest or the largest level. So it's not about the narrative, really. Meaning making is... I see meaning making as a human thing.
That's not a satisfactory answer for me. Maybe it is for you. But the fact that I can imbue meaning into something doesn't make me feel like life has meaning.
It doesn't feel satisfactory for me either, and I think there's shortcomings of that point of view, metaphysically. I mean, the way I tend to do it is, these days at least, is I can kind of relate to Marcus Aurelius here. Like, I can see various different possibilities for how the universe could be, and I can, like, shift between them, and then try to assess different phenomena and stuff from the perspective of the different possibilities. So I can see one that's more like Chris's. I can see one where there's like a grand narrative, but maybe not connected to like, anyway, I won't get into too much. But then there's like, yeah, so I can sort of see it. I sort of see it like that.
Yeah. So Ariel, you have a narrative which explains your place in the universe, right? And that allows you to imbue meaning into your actions, right?
No, I just explained. I no longer really see it in terms of like a single narrative that I like live within or like live within all the time. There's definitely certain narratives that I like prefer, but I tend to see like multiple narratives, like multiple possible ways for things can be, kind of like Marcus Aurelius. He's like, well, if it's this way, then we should act this way. And if it's this way, then we should act this way. And like, I kind of see it that way. Like, I kind of think it could be like all chaos and random, and the only order comes from us. And I could also see it being a harmonious whole where nothing that happens is bad. Everything that happens has a meaning. And we just try to be in harmony with everything. And I can also see it as a world polarized along an axis of good and evil. We try to reach towards good and avoid evil. So I can sort of see it in multiple ways.
Yeah, and I can also see it in multiple ways. I definitely agree with you that it's not certain that my narrative is correct. But my narrative, to me, is the only narrative in which doing anything makes sense. The other narratives that you said are possible, but then doing stuff doesn't actually make sense in those narratives. Why would you do anything if everything is completely chaotic and nothing is going anywhere?
Why would you not?
Because there's no point. What's the point of doing anything if nothing is good or bad?
To me, the point is the occurrence as it happens, or that can be a point. And to me, everything you're saying, like all of the different universes that you're presenting, are just narratives placed upon a substrate.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Like, even Chris's narrative, which is relatively direct, okay, life expands and takes over the multiverse. Why is that meaningful? To me, meaning and purpose are kind of like value. It's a question of to whom and why do you choose to interpret it that way. Some narratives are meaningful to some people and some narratives are not. Like the narrative of, okay, great, life took over the multiverse. What was the point of that? To me, it just leads to what is the point of that? Okay, great, we're in line with God. What's the point of that? Like, for me, you can always abstract more or less. So it's important. Every level of, I don't see like the meaning or the not meaning, the meaningfulness or the meaninglessness coming from the level that we're zoomed in on or out on. I just see everybody writing different perspectives and stories over a substrate and focusing on certain parts or not focusing on certain parts because it's meaningful to them.
I mean, I can tell you why, because it would be awesome. Because I'm part of life and I'm participating in a process of life potentially reversing entropy and creating a new universe. It's almost like...
I mean, great. I also think that would be awesome, but like that's just me being delighted that I think it's awesome.
Yeah, what's wrong with that?
It's to me, that's the same as me being delighted that my life was awesome and I spent a bunch of time dancing.
Well, no, but I mean, that seems like... I feel like there's such an arrogance to that, though. Like, if it was really true that there was a God and that there was a harmonious plan for the universe of some kind, let's say this was a universe of good and evil, then it seems to me there's something significantly different about being acting in line with that plan versus rebelling against it. Like, that's the whole idea of, like, the story of Lucifer. If you think you're smarter than existence and can do a better job than existence itself, then you're basically damned.
I mean, I'm not saying that I would choose not to align with that. It seems like participating in something great, if there was a great constructed plan, would be more interesting than trying to battle against something, especially than trying to battle against something that's all powerful and created the universe. But it's still, like, if we're saying that a being created the universe for a purpose, then it's like, okay, great. They created the universe for a purpose, like, for their purpose.
It doesn't even have to be a being. It can be...
Right. It could be anything. That was just an example. But
you're part of it, though. Like, you're not a separate thing from the universe where you can just step aside and evaluate it and decide if you like this universe or not. Like, every part of you is part of the universe.
Yeah, but I can still evaluate what part of that is meaningful to me or not.
I mean, again, to me, it's a matter of scale. You mentioned that spending your entire life dancing might give your life meaning, and it probably would do that to me too, because I like dancing. But that doesn't strike me as the most meaningful possible narrative. And to me, it's satisfying to have faith in the most meaningful possible narrative and participate in that.
Okay.
Even if it might end up...
Katie, if there is like a great story that we're all a part of on some level, and that story has a meaning, then according to that conception, there's no other meaning other than that story. You can either align with yourself with it, with the good or evil polarity. The idea is that when you align yourself with good, that's this identical to aligning yourself with meaning, and then meaning comes as a reward for that. And when you put yourself at odds with good, then you live a life that isn't meaningful, even if you're able to like convince yourself that you've constructed some kind of shallow individual meaning out of it.
Who's evaluating whether or not
there's no one evaluating? It just is.
My life is meaningful.
There might be something that's evaluating it beyond your personal judgment. Like that's what this model is. That's what the good and evil model is. You don't have to accept it, but
I'm saying, like, why do I care about how the other thing evaluates my life more than how I evaluate my life?
I mean, you don't have to care, but under this conception, if you want to have
a life that's judged meaningful by that thing,
well, that is meaningful in the universe, according to this conception.
So I disagree with that, Ariel.
I'm not saying this is how it is. I'm saying this is how this model works.
I'm saying that's not how my model works.
I'm not talking about your model, Chris.
Okay, I'm just pointing that out, that we are in
disagreement. Got it. It's not how your model works.
I guess on some level, and maybe this is something that I need to understand more, but I don't understand what it would even mean for us to be part of a grand story. Like, things are happening. The story is how we tell what happened. The narrative is how we recount what happened. And there's infinite stories within any large story.
That is an assumption. That is an assumption that holds true in the universe where there is no grand order.
Okay, but like, even if there is a grand order, why can't I step a level back and say what is happening is there is a thing that was done on purpose?
Wait, can you rephrase that question?
Okay, even if there was some intention behind everything that is happening now, and there's a narrative that's unfolding based on that intention, it would seem to me that we could zoom out another level from that and say, hey, look, isn't it interesting that something had an intention to do this thing? And that could be meaningful or pointless. Like, what was the point of putting all that work into that intention? You know what I mean?
Well, we don't really know what the level of abstraction beyond that level of abstraction would be. Here, maybe an example would help clarify this. So, like, let's say we live in a universe of good and evil, and let's say, just like this is a let's say statement. Let's say that one precept of good is that you do not harm and kill the innocent. Okay, and like let's say I constructed a personal story of meaning about my life. That what I was doing with my life was killing puppies and arranging their body in some shape, some symbolic shape that was meaningful to me. Maybe I'm a little crazy in this hypothetical. And so let's say I was just going around cutting up puppies and doing this weird thing. I'm like a puppy serial killer. So to me, that might be I'm getting a lot of meaning out of it. I'm getting a ton of meaning out of it, like in my personal conception. But like my mind is crazed, and ultimately I'm out of alignment with the universe in a pretty big way. And other human beings will respond to me instinctively as like, you're doing something very evil, very disturbing, very destructive. Like, it's not going to be randomly like some humans are like, ooh, I like it. Some humans are going to be like, not so much. There's going to be a pretty uniform response to me. So in this model that we're working within right now, I have a personal story that's out of alignment with the greater story of how the universe works. That greater story of how the universe works is embedded in the nature of the world, in the emotions the puppy feels of fear and whatever, in the way that people respond to me, and in the trajectory of my mind and of my soul. So maybe does that example, I know maybe I'm not getting to the root of your question, but...
Not really. I mean, because, okay, for one, the narrative that you presented was a narrative of good versus evil. And if that's the narrative, then that requires evil to be part of the story.
Yeah, well... could or it couldn't. There's different ways of looking at it.
But also, my question is more about who defined what good and evil were.
Your question is, why should we listen to this dumb god anyway?
I'm not saying it's dumb, but it is kind of like, it's still, if God exists, then God is part of nature. And God is what God is.
I think maybe another example might be helpful. The way that I see things is that, yes, God is a part of nature, and yes, all of us and all of life together sort of are participating in this process that we call God. And the earth is a life form. And so the way I see myself is like a cell in a human body. So, maybe I'm a blood cell, maybe I'm a nerve cell, maybe I'm a liver cell or something like that. And if I know that that's what I am, then I'm going to have certain things that I do that are sort of my purpose to fulfill. I have certain processes that I do, and I release energy or something like that into the body, and the body survives because of the work that I'm doing and the work that everybody else is doing. And so, but I could become a cancer cell, and I could choose to work against the body. And the way that I see this good and evil question, or this morality question, and this meaningfulness question is kind of like through that lens. It's kind of like, okay, well, there's this thing that I'm in where there are things that I can do that are definitely good for it, and things that I can do that are definitely bad for it, and I should try to do the things that are good for it. I'm not just this island. I'm not just a universe unto myself. That's kind of how I see things.
Okay, Katie, yeah. That's a good example, Chris. The way I see it, Katie, is there's two ways of looking at it. There's a way of looking at it like the Marcus Aurelius, like everything is part of a grand unified whole and it's all in harmony, and even evil is part of the plan. And in that conception, the only real argument for not being evil would be, well, evil brings suffering. Evil brings damnation for your soul. Evil isn't really evil, but it brings personal darkness to you, because then you're choosing to be an evil part of the story. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is a more Manichaean universe where good and evil are in some kind of battle. Good has some purpose that's very important, and all meaning aligns with good. And so if you choose evil, you're basically choosing a life of subverting meaning and of meaninglessness. Whereas if you choose good, you're choosing a life of meaning. And so I think those are the way the two models would differ.
What does it mean for something to be important? And do you guys have a conception of important and something being important that doesn't require a to whom? Because for me, the idea of something being important begs the question, to whom?
Of course. I agree with that. I do things that are important to me. But I use what all of humanity seems to agree is important as a important piece of information in how I decide what's important.
I don't know. I don't necessarily think that important requires a who. I don't even know what a who is. Like, is a tree a who?
A perspective that could value something as being important or not.
Like, what is their perspective require consciousness?
I think probably you would require consciousness in order to be able to value something. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that. But I'm saying it requires a judger or a valuer to value something.
I don't know. I think that's anthropocentric. Like, when you look at trees, like, I doubt that they have consciousness, but they definitely, there are things the trees consider to be important and to have value, and they're still alive. And I see the universe.
Does a tree consider something to be important?
It doesn't consider something to be important, but there are things that are important to the tree.
I think that's a meaningless distinction.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. So anyway, I think that distinction actually helps get to the root of your question, Katie, about importance, because I don't think importance...
There are things that are important in order for the tree to survive.
There are things that are important to the tree, regardless of whether the tree has consciousness of it.
But trees are important in order for us to survive.
I mean, because you put life as like your basic unit of value, so you can't just say trees are just important because they're important to us.
I see the world as kind of analogous to a human body. Okay, so it's this ecosystem, and humans are one part of that ecosystem, but there are other parts of that ecosystem, and I think it's really arrogant for us to think that the other parts of the ecosystem aren't important. That would be like the brain cells being like, well, only brain cells matter.
I guess to get to the root of what I think is the root of the question, I think it's definitely possible that there could be things that are important without there necessarily being a consciousness of those things being important or not.
I guess I have no idea what that means.
Well, I mean, I think I can think of some pretty basic examples. Like, there's definitely things in human history that have been important, even when we weren't aware of them.
Maybe not important to a valuer, but important to some end.
Yeah, I think there can be an end without there being a conscious valuer, necessarily. I don't think conscious things...
But so then why should we place importance? Why should a conscious valuer place importance on some end?
I think there's a lot of reasons.
I just want to say one more thing on this topic, which is that in the book, Marcus Aurelius says that if you do evil, you're only hurting yourself. And so if other people do evil, they're not hurting you. You're the only person that can damage yourself by damaging your character. So I think that's important and relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I guess, Katie, like, I'm not trying to evade the question, but I kind of feel like I just answered it when I gave the distinction between a world of good and evil, where good and evil are both part of a harmonious whole, and being evil is basically bad because it brings your personal doom in the evil side, versus a world where good and evil were in a Manichaean war and meaning lies with good. And so when you align yourself with goods, you align yourself with meaning. So I kind of feel like I just answered that question. Maybe that answer was unsatisfactory in some way.
Yeah, it doesn't answer it to me.
Why not?
Because it just seems like another level of abstraction.
Okay, because then you can ask, why should meaning matter to me? Basically.
Well, why should meaning... I guess what I'm trying to say is the question, why should meaning matter to me, is a weird one, because to me, meaning... I mean, you're defining meaning as in line with some kind of system.
In this particular model, because that's how this particular model that we're talking about works.
Okay. So I guess, yeah, in that particular model, meaning is defined as being in line with the health of the system. And
with the meaning of the system. There's a big meaning.
Okay, well, I guess I'm asking, why is the system meaningful? And to whom is the system meaningful?
Because the system gave rise to you, and you're an integral part of it.
That's fine. I guess, I don't know if we're going to go anywhere, but...
I don't know that there needs to be a to whom necessarily, but there could be a to whom. There could be...
or a to what?
We don't know. We don't know what the to whom or to what is, but there could be, like, put a black box there, put like, let X equal whatever the ultimate purpose is, and take it as an act of faith that act of purpose isn't something completely wicked. I mean, it could be that we're just in an evil universe. Like, it could be that this whole universe is just, like, some kind of sick simulation by an alien species to develop weapons to oppress their slaves or something. Like, it could be the whole universe has an evil purpose, and that our ultimate good would just be to be agents of chaos and destruction for this terrible universe. Like, that is possible.
Or our universe could be Rick's car battery.
Rick's car. I don't know the reference.
Oh, it's a Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty.
Where he creates a universe. He creates a universe and uses that to create energy. And it's this, like, little mini universe that fits inside his car battery, and he uses that to power his car.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, and I mean, what I'm saying is, I could choose to have that matter to me, or I could choose to have it not matter to me.
No, but I mean, in the conception where it matters.
Where it matters to who?
Or it matters to whatever the highest.
Where it matters to
purpose.
Rick?
It could be the Rick. It could be the evil. The idea is,
my question would be why doesn't it matter to you? Why wouldn't it matter to you?
I mean, I think part of the idea is that if the universe does have an ultimate purpose and you're choosing to put yourself at odds with that purpose, then under one conception there's a possibility of really negative consequences on yourself. Like, you'll never be in alignment in life, and you'll suffer, and you'll move towards darkness if you choose that path. And another conception is that your life will be wasted if you make that choice under this model.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to be a cancer cell in the body of life?
According to the standard of whatever the highest purpose is. But I mean, I guess...
I mean, to me personally, it would depend on whether or not I agreed with what the body was doing.
So you'd want to be a cancer cell in Hitler's body?
Yes. Absolutely.
I mean, I guess an assumption of some of these objective meaning systems is that the universe is gooder and smarter than you are. It's the idea of hubris, right? But if you don't share that assumption, or if you're critical of that assumption, then I guess it does make sense to just
Right. I mean, I assume that the universe, that the concepts of good and smart don't make any sense when we're talking about the universe. If there was a God and I found out that that was true, I guess I would probably assume that he was gooder and smarter than me, or she was gooder and smarter than me until proven otherwise. But if I found out that God was Hitler's body, then I would go cancer. Like, I don't know. But my assumption is that goodness or smartness makes no sense to me.
Yeah, because you're not in this model. We're not exploring your model. We're exploring this other model, right? That's what we're trying to do here.
Okay. Well, but I mean, in that other model, then the universe is a thing that's good and smart. What does it mean for it to be good and smart if there's nothing outside of it?
Well, the idea is there might be something outside of it. The idea is that it could be a lot of things. Place X there.
No, the idea is that if you're a cell in Hitler's body, there's no way you could possibly know that. Well, first of all, like, maybe Hitler did have a lot of evil cells in his body, and that's the reason why he turned out he did the way that he did. But like your life, like, it's not your place as a cell to like discover what the grand plan is and then decide whether you agree with it or not. Your place is just to be a cell and be the best cell that you can be.
Okay, why? Let's take it down to a metaphor that we can actually understand. Like, let's say that humans were bred by some other type of being on Earth in order to be slaves to construct some pyramids. And you're trying to tell me it's not your place as a human to decide if you want to construct these pyramids or not. And you're never even going to be able to know why they're building the pyramids, so build the pyramids. And I'm like, okay, I mean, maybe building the pyramids is good. Maybe building the pyramids is bad. I don't know. Maybe I'll decide to align with it because that seems cool and I value being a part of building a greater thing. But I also think it's perfectly valid for me to not build the pyramids.
I mean, I think the difference in that situation is that a slave is still something that's separate from the work of the slave. It would be more like if you were one of the rocks in the pyramid. Like, we're part of the universe. Like, in a way, we can't really rebel against it. Like, when that's part of Aurelius' thing. Like, when we rebel against the universe, we're just rebelling against ourselves.
Well, you're saying that certain actions that I could take would be aligned with the universe and certain actions would not be aligned with the universe.
Under this conception, yes.
Then that's very different than a rock. Like, a rock can't choose to do something that would be not aligned with the pyramid.
Yeah, so I find myself kind of agreeing with Katie a little bit. Like, you know, the Nazis who were tried at Nuremberg were like, you know, well, we were just a part of the organism, you know, we were just doing our job, you know, and you know, that wasn't evil. In that case, maybe we should judge them because they should have known that what they were doing was evil. But I think that, I don't know, I think if you keep all of life as your frame, then you can't be like, life is on this terrible mission. But if you do decide that, then it makes sense that you should dissent and not do it.
Right. And I mean, I just want to clarify, like, I totally try to act like I try to be a good person. I do a lot of things to try to be a good person. I just want to clarify for the audience. I'm not rebelling against the universe.
Your super ego got its moment. I think one of the differences here is, again, the difference between this idea that everything is a harmonious whole and that evil is still part of the plan. And again, it comes down to that difference versus the idea that there's good and evil, and evil is not part of the plan. Evil is what subverts the plan, which is more the conception laid out in Genesis. Like, the idea that, in a way, like, one way of interpreting Genesis is that God willingly allowed evil into the world. Like, God willingly allowed the possibility for the plan to fail. Is in doing so, we get freedom. And so the good choice is only meaningful because we have the chance to make the bad choice.
Yes, exactly. And also, sometimes the plan needs to be subverted because the plan is bad. And in that case, something that seems evil from one sense might be actually good in a larger sense.
I guess that's like where the Gnostic thing comes in, like that they view God as evil.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is part of our difference too, is like, I know we're talking about abstractions and things that could be possible and not necessarily talking about like Christian God, but I think that that's a lot of what we're thinking of when we're thinking about these different models. And probably a lot of what's informing me is that, like, the most popular model out there of, like, a good and evil universe with a purpose because a God made it, like, when I look at that God and how they behave, I'm kind of like, I don't want to be in line with that God. Seems kind of evil to me.
Okay, but I think what Marcus Aurelius is arguing is that to participate in nature is actually to participate in your own purpose, which you should be able to just kind of look inside yourself and see. So in order to rebel against what Aurelius is saying, you'd have to rebel against yourself. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, don't rebel against yourself.
Right. That's what Aurelius is saying. Yeah.
And that's where like one thing, like I often do tend to think that like really big historical events or major trends in history are in some way like part of a greater whole that is meaningful in some way. And so I find it strange when people like kind of have the worldview that Katie just articulated, like this idea that one of the greatest religious trends of all time is just evil. It's just evil. The Abrahamic tradition is evil. It sucks. Like I just find that to be so, like it's like just like such a almost like such a rejection of such a huge part of existence. I just find it so strange.
Well, but maybe that person who rejects the Abrahamic tradition has a greater purpose, which is to be against the Abrahamic tradition.
Yeah, that's possible.
So maybe we shouldn't judge that person.
Yeah, and I mean, the Abrahamic tradition has only been a thing for like a couple thousand years in a universe of billions of years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the assumption would be that human beings are a significant part of any greater story that's happening.
And that what we've lived so far is a big enough chunk. Well, and also I'm not saying Abrahamic religions aren't significant or haven't done anything good. I just don't like the philosophy. I'm not saying that it hasn't influenced the world or that I wish that it was never a thing, or I'm just saying I don't like the philosophy moving forward. And I don't think it's accurate. And I don't think it would be good if it was accurate. There's a lot of other religions too.
Do you think that the other religions are better? Or do you think that they're all kind of flawed in the same way?
I think all religions are flawed in different ways. I like some of what I've seen from Buddhism, although I don't know that much about Buddhism, to be honest. I don't think that... No, I don't know if there's any religions that I think are better, but I wouldn't say they're flawed in the same way.
But do you think you know enough about the Abrahamic religions to make like some sweeping philosophical conclusions about them?
I grew up in a society that is founded on the Abrahamic religions and was taught them as a child. And
okay, so that's a yes.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you feel like you gain or the world gains from you like having this perspective of like the Abrahamic traditions are on balance evil and I wish they didn't exist? Like, what is the point?
I didn't say that.
Okay, what is your view then in a nutshell?
I think that humans would live in more peace and harmony if they didn't believe in the Abrahamic religions, and I think that it would. I think that the Abrahamic religions contribute to self-loathing.
Yeah, I mean that's a much more.
It's kind of like what somebody might say about, being a left-winger or being a right-winger. You just disagree with it.
I think that, and I recognize not all people who believe in Abrahamic religions believe this way, but I think that believing in an ultimate authority that tells you what's right and wrong, and, well, even that in and of itself, I think that believing in an ultimate authority that has declared what's right and wrong is a harmful thing in and of itself.
I mean, if you don't do it, then somebody else will, and they'll get a lot of followers and take over.
It's not about that. It's just about saying that there is a right and wrong beyond what we individually choose. Like, and, there's a lot of danger to just saying like to leaving it up to the individual as well.
But it's not only about that. It's about there are specific rights and wrongs laid out in books, and it is about believing in an authority that says what's right and wrong. Like, whether or not there isn't a right and wrong outside of that is a different point. But the Abrahamic religions are about a God.
Yeah, but that God can be understood metaphorically or in a lot of different ways, and those rules can also be understood in a lot of different ways. Like, see the vast proliferation of different Abrahamic religions.
Yeah.
And subsects of those religions.
Okay, I mean, if you want to argue that this religion should be the religion that motivates and influences the world, but it should be a metaphor and people shouldn't actually believe in the God, then fine.
I'm not saying it should be. I'm not saying that it should be the single religion that motivates everyone. That's like definitely not what I said.
I'm saying that believing in a God that laid down these rules is harmful, and you're saying that the religion isn't necessarily harmful because you can take the God as a metaphor.
I'm not sure what rules you're talking about, or like I'm not really sure what you're talking about specifically.
This conversation is getting into like religious territory. Like it's I don't know if this is fruitful for us to keep going down this path.
Okay, I guess we can just go straight to question 4. Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed and you haven't been. So how do we square this with the lessons from the psychopath code? This idea that if you don't feel harmed, you haven't been harmed. How do we square this with our awareness that some people in the world truly are malevolent?
I think that Aurelius would disagree with the notion that some people are fundamentally malevolent. I think that he would say people are misguided, but that they can be influenced to get their life back on track and start producing value for the world.
Sorry, I'm still a little shell-shocked. I don't know if I agree with your interpretation, Chris, because if we're bringing in the idea of psychopaths or people who truly are malevolent, then it's not just about them making a mistake and being human and making a mistake. But I think that we could square it by saying that psychopaths too are ignorant and psychopaths too are a part of nature. And you don't have to feel harmed by someone who's acting out of the way they are. You can conceptualize them as a force of nature.
Yeah, like at one point in the book, he says that everyone has their nature. Some people's nature is to be like a child. Some people's nature is to be like a prey. Some people's nature is to be like a predator. So you'd probably just say their nature is to act like a predator.
Yeah, I think maybe I want to revise what I said a little bit. I think what he would probably say is that, and if you go back and look at the psychopath code, there are certain types of personalities that are particularly vulnerable to psychopaths. Those are people who Marcus Aurelius maybe would say have the soul of prey or something like that. But I think what Aurelius would also say is that maybe the reason why those people are able to be preyed on by predators is because they allow the predators to get under their skin. They take the predator as something that is other than a force of nature. They take the predator as this. Basically, if you were a stoic in the face of a predator, the predator would have no effect on you. Whereas if you were letting the things that the predator did affect you, then that's not being stoic. And so if you were a stoic, then the predator would probably just avoid you.
I don't think he's saying that the predator would avoid you if you were stoic. I think he's saying that you don't need to be offended by the predator.
Right. I don't think he's saying that the predator would avoid you. I think I'm saying that. But Aurelius is saying that if somebody is a predator, then all you have to do to avoid being preyed on them, all you have to do to avoid being harmed by them is to interpret their actions in a certain way.
I guess this kind of gets back to the first question we asked, like, is there some good and bad about dying or being injured or something like that? Because he's saying choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. And in one sense, I think that's true. But your body, at least in my view, can be actually harmed. I guess you can choose to step back and take the view that you weren't harmed and you're just rejoining the universe, and it's kind of the same thing.
I think Marcus would say you got to do what you got to do. Like if someone's attacking you, then you defend yourself, but you do it without disturbing the balance of your mind. And if you do get like attacked to the point where you're going to be killed, regardless of what you can do, like if you can't prevent it, like the Serenity Prayer again, then you just accept that it's your time to die.
Yeah, like this cigarette smoke right now. I mean,
I thought you were like checking your BO.
Somebody's smoking like right next door. And so I'm doing what I can do, which is breathe from my shirt.
But you're not allowing it to disturb the balance of your mind.
Exactly.
Choosing to have affection for the people that are making the mistakes and really harming themselves by smoking cigarettes. Recognizing that they are fallible human beings. Choosing not to be angry or take it personally. That they have this vice.
Exactly. Just being stoic over here.
I don't know, but then like if you were really getting upset, maybe you'd like go on some kind of anti-cigarette campaign for the building, and it would grow into like an anti-cigarette campaign for the city, and then there would be fewer people smoking indoors, and then you'd have like resolved the problem at a societal level.
I think the ideal would be to do that without getting upset.
That would be the ideal.
I think the ideal would be to spend my time on things that are more worth my time.
Well, yeah, but I mean, in the context of this example, I mean, I think that would be the ideal for sure. But the question is, does having a reaction provide an extra motivation to action where there's more of a tendency for you to affect change than if you're just stoic?
See, okay, I think having a reaction does provide a tendency towards action if you have an untrained mind. Like for most people, they're not going to do anything about anything unless they're having an extreme negative emotional reaction about it. However, I do wonder if for a stoic, for someone who's very much in control about their thoughts and thinking through their thoughts and actions, if suppressing heavy emotional reactions or trying to work through heavy emotional reactions would have the same impact. Like, I don't think that we would be in a stagnant world if we were in like a deep stoic world where everyone could write reflections as deep as Marcus about these issues. I think we'd be in a better world than we are now.
Maybe not at this point in history, but I think if we'd always been in a stoic world, I'm kind of doubtful medical science would be as far as it is.
Well, if we were in a world where the main philosophy was stoicism and not something that motivated people to action, I think you're probably right. But if we were in a world where everybody was a learned stoic, I think we would be further.
I think Aurelius would disagree with you. I think he would say that well, I disagree with you. It's not necessarily up to the philosophy which led to medical science. It might be due to the increases in technology, and the increases in technology might be due to this logos that Aurelius believes in. It's this kind of force this guiding force of the universe. So maybe it's that which caused all of these great things that we have, and not just our philosophy of becoming, as it were.
Well, I think the philosophy had an impact on it. I mean, you could say that the logos caused the philosophy to happen, but
yeah, exactly. Maybe.
But the philosophy is part of that change.
Yeah, the philosophy of becoming played a huge role in like Western dominance and technological progress. Like the West didn't have the most advanced technology in the 1400s, but they had like the becoming attitude, like a dissatisfaction with how things were and a desire for like change. And that's why even though China had better ships, like Europe was the one that colonized the world and reaped all the material benefits from that. I want to go back to a previous point, but do you guys want to respond to that, what I just said maybe, or?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the difficult things about this philosophy is that you have to be able to discern which things are worth trying and which things are not worth trying. And that takes experience. And experience takes being upset by stuff and trying to change it. And so when you're young, you're not going to be, and inexperienced, you're not going to be a very effective stoic, because you're going to be sitting there like, shit, I don't actually know which things I can control. And so you're going to be constantly lashing out and trying to change things, and you're going to be really unsatisfied with everything. But eventually, as you get older and you get more experienced, you should be able to figure out which things you're likely to be able to change and which things you're not.
I mean, that's again limited in a world that's, the more dynamic the world is, the less that holds true. It's like the problem of induction, right? Like if things are changing all the time, then the stuff that might have been good to focus on when you were young might be, see the rise of the internet. You guys understand the point I'm making? Okay, well, I'll rephrase. And the point that you're making, Chris, that like as you get older, it'll become more clear what it's important to focus on, assumes a constancy in the world that might have held true more in Marcus's time than in our own. If the world is dynamic and constantly changing, then the things that it made sense to focus on when you were in your apprenticeship learning phase might be obsolete by the time you get older.
True, but I think you'll still have a heuristic as you age and get more experience. You'll still have a better and better heuristic as to which things you're likely to be able to make a difference in and which things you won't. Or put a better way, which things are worth trying to change and worth putting the time and effort into trying to change, and which things are not, because you have better things to attend to.
True enough. I can definitely grant that point. I kind of wanted to return to an earlier point of Katie's about like how if for an untrained mind, you maybe need to be like really attached to something or really worked up about something to spur positive action. But if you have a trained mind, a mind trained in Stoicism or Buddhism or something, then maybe you don't need that so much. And it makes me think of the Yerkes-Dodson law, like the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which is the idea that as you become more aroused, you become better at simple tasks in like a pretty smooth upwards curve. So like, let's say there's something that is like moderately difficult for you. As you drink more coffee, you'll become better and better and better at it. Like for me, let's say that's like building websites. Like as I drink more coffee, I become better and better and better at it. Maybe past a certain point it plateaus, but I'm making myself more and more aroused, and I become more and more aroused, I can complete the task better. Versus like something like writing a story, which is a very difficult task for me. For difficult tasks, the Yerkes-Dodson curve is a bell curve. So when you're moderately aroused, you're best at it, but when you're highly aroused, you become worse at it. So if I was drinking a lot of coffee, there'd be a certain point beyond which I can't write at all. And so it makes me think like that, like being attached or being really worked up about something, there's probably like certain kinds of pursuits in life that it makes you really good at, where it provides like a lot of fuel and fire. But maybe there's some things that are harder, more subtle, and more valuable that being worked up about makes impossible to do.
I think that's absolutely true. When you're worked up, you can't sit and analyze and think about taking very complex strategic action, which is a lot of what our world needs now. That's probably a lot of the problem that we see in politics today is like people are so worked up that there's no way to get to any real solutions.
I was going to say, and it could be the case that in past times, what we needed was for people to be highly aroused to complete like moderately difficult tasks. But now like the low-hanging fruit are picked, so we need to be at a higher level of consciousness.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like the way that humans evolved, living in nature, where our main problems were getting food for today and fighting off predators and fighting off invaders, arousal is 100% what you need. And that's the way that our brains evolved. You need motivation into easy to moderately difficult action. But now that we're playing this long civilization game, the problems of civilization are not helped by arousal.
I mean, I was even thinking of like different curves. Like it could be that even like inventing all the technological inventions that we did required like high arousal and were moderately difficult tasks on the like scale, who knows how far it goes of like tasks that we need to accomplish.
So I have a theory of how this might work in practice and why people continue becoming aroused and angry about things, even though it doesn't necessarily lead to better problem solving abilities. According to Hitchens, anger is a social emotion, and what it does is it tends to lead other people to try and fix the problem. So if a lot of people are angry about something, it probably causes the people who are more stoic, people who are less angry and more able to solve problems, to actually go and solve those problems and solve the issue of the anger.
That makes sense.
Probably a part of it, for sure. Do we want to move on to the final quote?
Sure. Okay, so moving on to our final passage, Marcus says something interesting. He says, "If it does not harm the community, it does not harm its members. When you think you've been injured, apply this rule. If the community isn't injured by it, neither am I. And if it is, anger is not the answer. show the offender where he went wrong. So Marcus basically says that if something doesn't harm a community, it doesn't harm its members. How might that conflict or complement our modern ideas about individual rights?
Well, what Marcus would say is that a lot of people who are up in arms about individual rights need to be a little bit more stoic.
This is a very collectivist statement. It's basically saying that you can't be harmed unless your collective as a whole is harmed. It's basically saying that an individual doesn't matter and it's perfectly valid to sacrifice an individual for the good of the collective. It kind of reminds me of, I'm forgetting the name. Does anybody know that short story about a utopia that's basically like a very harmonious society, but they're torturing one child in a corner in a basement? Okay, I'll have to look that up. But basically the point of the story is that people were able to live in harmony in a community by taking out all of their negative emotions on a sacrificial child.
I think Marcus, I think we got to remember what Marcus means by good and evil, right? Because Marcus specifically says in an earlier quote that we look at, that wealth, success, prosperity, life, and health are not good, not evil, they just are. So Marcus would probably say that if a community is like torturing a kid on the side, even if it appeared to be harmonious elsewhere, that's bad for the community. Just like if we're living a good life outwardly, that we're torturing some part of ourselves, or we're torturing a squirrel in our basement or whatever, we're not truly in harmony. It's bad for us. It's not bad for the squirrel. It's bad for us.
Yeah, I disagree that this is a collectivist philosophy. I think it's actually highly individualist. I think what Marcus would say is that if something isn't bad for the collective, the individuals in the collective should be taking care of their own needs. So, yeah, anything that doesn't harm the collective is not going to harm an individual.
But Marcus wouldn't say that there's anything outside of what's good for the collective or bad for the collective. Like Marcus wouldn't say that, like, okay, you do what you want for you do your civic duty for the collective, and then you go home and you put up your feet and watch some Netflix and eat some popcorn, and that's really fine as far as I'm like. Marcus wouldn't say that. Marcus would say you do your duty for the collective, and then you go home and you do more duty, and then you're allowed to sleep, and then you wake up early and you do more duty. Like as far as Marcus is concerned, you have to be doing good all the time. There's no like moment where you get to be like libertine and unaccountable to nature and goodness.
Well, I don't see anything particularly wrong with watching Netflix and eating popcorn, other than popcorn is a grain and I wouldn't do that. But
Marcus would view it as self-indulgent. He's really against that. Marcus would say you can't be like, the way his worldview is like everything is connected. Like you can't be self-indulgent at home when you're alone and then be like disciplined and self-sacrificing when you're out in the court ruling Rome. Like he views it as an interconnected whole.
I see no way that this is individualist at all.
Because if you're Stoic, you're taking care of your own needs. So in a Stoic society, everybody would be taking care of their own individual needs. That's very individualistic. You're not expecting people to take care of each other. You hope that they would, and you try to do that for yourself. But you're not, if they fail to do that, you're not going to like judge them.
Well, people take care of their own mental goodness. That's definitely part of the philosophy.
Yeah.
But it's more a responsibility. It's not like there's no real talk of personal needs. It's you're doing good all the time. And you do good all the time by constantly having mental peace and control and working hard.
Okay, so a Stoic philosophy would expect people to manage their own goodness in their own mind. But what he's saying here is that if you feel you've been harmed and the collective has not been harmed, then you have not been harmed. That seems to me to be saying that you could sacrifice any individual human being for the good of the collective and no harm was done. I don't see how that's compatible with individual. Like, there's individual responsibility in order to serve the whole, but there seems to be no recognition or care for like the worth of the individual. Everything that the individual is supposed to do in terms of aligning the goodness in their own mind is in service of the whole.
Yeah. I think the idea is if you've spurred someone else to evil against you, or if someone else has, someone shot you or something, then that the collective has been harmed, or that other person has been harmed because they've been moved to evil. But there's definitely no room for, like, there's nothing libertine about this philosophy. Like, you're always supposed to be good and trying to inspire good in others.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody is victimizing a child, then I don't think Marcus Aurelius would say that was good. I think he would say, you're supposed to be looking after your own behavior, and if somebody else is misbehaving, then the collective should do something about that. Well, you can judge that person and try to influence them to change their behavior, point out what's wrong, and then there should be some kind of like civic process if somebody's doing something criminal. I do think that if somebody is like torturing a child in a corner as a scapegoat for all of society's ills, then that's something he would probably say is harming the collective, is harming the community.
Well, the premise of the premise of that story is that was what was keeping the community as harmonious as it was. The premise of that story is that was good for the community. Maybe we can disagree with that premise and that it's possible.
Yeah, each person has to judge what's good for the community.
Yeah, I think Marcus, that's not what Marcus would say. He'd say it's accorded by nature. But Marcus would say that community's, everyone who participates in the harming of the child is being harmed, because they're carrying out bad. That's his whole, how he defines good and evil. If I hurt you, I'm the one that's truly harmed.
So good and bad is only within the individual psyche.
Yeah, within your individual psyche, basically. But by the same token, there's nothing libertine about that, because by the same token, if you do something that he would consider to be like bad, even if it harms nobody else in an external way, which he wouldn't really view as harm, then you've still done wrong. So if you're going home every day and gorging on chocolate before bed, maybe that harms no one else, but externally, but he would say you're doing a lot of harm to yourself. Therefore it's bad.
Would he say that harms the community? I suppose because it makes you a less strong-willed person to be able to help the community?
Yeah, and then there's a community that has a more evil person in it.
Well, and importantly, this is something that the individual can do something about. If you're doing harm to yourself and harm to your community, then as a Stoic, you should be judging yourself and you should be changing your behavior. And
there's something to it, right? Like, you look somewhere like the United States, like obesity, it's definitely harming the community in a big way, even if it's the result of a billion tiny individual decisions.
It is. I guess what is the distinction he's making here? Like, if we're saying that Marcus's whole conception of good and bad is within one's own psyche, then why does he add this metric that if it doesn't harm the community, it doesn't harm the individual? Because it seems like the heuristic is still just about whether or not you're doing good or doing bad within your own psyche.
Well, I think how I interpret this is the message Marcus is trying to get across is, if you feel like you've been harmed and you're sitting there stewing over something, then try to put it in perspective and be like, okay, it hasn't actually harmed the community. I'm just salty. I should just move on. I should recognize that no harm has been done here. I've just allowed the balance of my mind to be harmed.
Could you give an example of a situation like that?
Okay, well, maybe an example could be like, maybe I'm really pissed off about how our debate about Abrahamism went. Maybe I leave and I'm like, oh, that Katie, can't she see, and I'm like going off like that. Then maybe I should think of Marcus's maxim and be like, okay, wait, well, no harm to the community has been done. It was an interesting conversation. We disagreed. And there's nothing for me to be mad about. I'm just harming myself, and I'm actually causing harm to the community if I'm like stewing about it and allowing negative emotions to take up space in my mind.
Okay. That was a good illustration. That was a good illustration.
Yeah, good job with that, Ariel.
Thanks, guys.
I guess I kind of wanted to ask, after reading Meditations, maybe this isn't the best wrap up. I'll just ask it and then we can decide. But I'm kind of motivated to ask, after reading Meditations, did you guys find Marcus Aurelius's philosophy to be coherent?
I think there's areas where there's challenges to coherence. Like I think it's hard to square his idea of like a completely harmonious and deterministic universe with the idea of personal gods who intervene in one's life. But I guess it's not really, because I guess there could be a harmonious universe that includes personal gods who happen to intervene. Like the gods would just be like a level of abstraction below the harmony.
Yeah, I think from a certain angle, it's coherent, like viewed from a certain sort of metaphysical standpoint.
One thing that was tough for me was he talks about not judging external things as good or bad because they're part of nature, but it's like he draws a line where he doesn't consider his own thoughts and our own internal worlds to be part of nature, and he judges our own internal thoughts as good or bad. And that implies some kind of a separation between the universe and ourselves on one level, whereas on another level, he sees everything about us as part of the whole.
So again, I think what he's trying to emphasize is that there are things that you have control over and things that you don't have control over. You have control over your own thoughts, and so you should try to control those. You don't have control over other people's thoughts, and so you shouldn't try to control those.
If we do have control over our own thoughts and we have free will, then it means that the universe, it's hard to reconcile that with a universe that's completely harmonious and deterministic.
Yeah, but I think what he would say is that since nature endowed us with control over our thoughts, then it's perfectly reasonable for us to exercise that control.
But if the universe was truly a harmonious whole that happens only once and can happen only once, then our thoughts as well would happen only once and could be no other way than they are. And so there's no point in us trying to exert control over them.
Right. I see him making the distinction on nature and nature being harmonious, not on the level of your own circles of impact, because there are certainly actions that you can take pretty reliably to impact things as well. Or maybe he just doesn't see it that way. Maybe that's what it is. He just doesn't, kind of like Chris said, he doesn't think that you can control anything outside of yourself. But that's not the point that he emphasizes.
He definitely says people who are foolish and unwise and all that are still part of the grand plan. But I mean, one way of looking at it, like there's one part of the book where he talks about like, he sort of asks like, even the buffoon is part of the grand plan, but do you really want to be the buffoon? So that sort of suggests a model to me where like, maybe the universe is somehow self-correcting. Like, I'm trying to think of an example, almost like in ecosystems, like if different organisms in different niches, and if you get rid of one organism, something else will come to fill the niche. So it could be that just the universe is like, it is harmonious in that it always comes back to a particular pattern. Even if you try to pull it in this direction, it'll come back like an elastic band. And so you can sort of choose which role you want to play, and you can choose to be like the wise statesman, or you can choose to be the hero, or you can choose to be the buffoon, or you can choose to be the villain. But someone's going to have to be one of those roles. And so you might as well choose to be good. But then I guess the follow-up to that is then you're just sort of dooming someone else to be one of the miserable roles.
Right. It's an interesting. So basically, my takeaway, or what I was going to try to get at with my view on this, is I think that Marcus Aurelius developed a very good personal philosophy for his life and for helping him cope with his life and take actions and think thoughts that would be helpful to him. But I don't think that it's a particularly well thought out, logically consistent philosophy.
I mean, I would say it was definitely well thought out, logically consistent. Maybe not as much, but I mean, he was like in his 50s when he wrote this, and he studied philosophy all of his life. So I would say that it wasn't well thought out.
Yeah.
Okay, not well thought out, like with regard to consistency or justification for the things for the arguments that he puts out. Or maybe that's just not what this book is for.
I mean, I think it's like the beginning of a conversation in some ways that we're much further ahead on. Like there's definitely a conflict between the idea that we have free will and the idea that we live in a harmonious universe where everything is meant to happen the way it happens. But that's, he was sort of weighing in on that debate like a really long time ago. And since then, like that debate has like really evolved, and it's been something we've been talking about for a long time. So, it is a tough point. It is a point of tension for sure, but I think it's a little bit unfair to expect Marcus Aurelius to be like post-Western Enlightenment philosophy on that one.
Well, and again, I don't know if this might be something like Stoicism might be something like Buddhism, where it's like ennobling provocations, right, rather than logically consistent truths, where because you hold these beliefs, it allows you to live with more freedom and less stress. And by doing that, you're actually contributing more value to the world than you would have.
Yeah, like probably like the dictum or like the what do you call it? They call it provocation to like morally judge your own actions and your own thoughts pretty stringently, but to be tolerant and kind towards others is, or has more to do with like an attitude towards the world that's useful rather than, it's not that it's not that Marcus Aurelius happened to be more important than everybody else, even though he was pretty important, right? Or it's not that I'm just more important than everyone else, so I'm going to pay attention to my own. It's just that I happen to be me, so it's useful to think that way. It has more to do with just it's more of a useful hack than it is a statement about how the universe works. Exactly.
And you did, and going back to what you were saying at the beginning of the episode about how, well, I disagree with Aurelius's philosophy because we have this becoming thing that's led to all of this, that's led to all of this progress and all of this higher standard of living. While that may be true, it's also true that the Roman Empire lasted for another 200 or 300 years after Aurelius. And maybe the reason for that is that the reigning philosophy of the time was Stoicism. And maybe it was the best philosophy for that period and that place in history.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end.
Sure. All right. Well, yeah, I agree with you guys generally. I think that's probably a good place to wrap up on this. Thank you guys for joining us for this episode on Marcus Aurelius. If you enjoyed this and want more content of us arguing about different philosophies, we've got plenty of it. So like, subscribe, share, all of those things. Check us out on Patreon. We're there as well, where we upload bonus content, and we have lots of great goodies for our patrons as well. And hope to see you next time. Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversityproject.co.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.